Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Festival Hall and the Reedville Fishermens Museum Winter-Spring Lecture Series. This is the last lecture of our series this year. We'll start again next February. This is also the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the Reedville Fishermens Museum this year. So we're celebrating. Tonight I would like to welcome Wendy Clarke. She's a well-known journalist and the editor-at-large, or previous one, of the Chesapeake Bay magazine. She's here to talk, and she's been on the Chesapeake Bay and very interested in the happenings of the Chesapeake Bay and history. That she's written a book, and it's Stillwater Bending, and it's about the Chesapeake Bay. But anyway, without further ado, I'm just going to let Wendy come up and give her a little bit of a further background and talk about her book. Thank you.
I want to first say thank you so much for letting me come here to Reedville, because Reedville is what inspired a lot of this book, the whole Little Wicomico and this whole region. So very close to my heart, and I'm really excited to be here tonight. What I'd like to do is I'd like to read two parts of the book, and then do a little presentation sort of talking about how this all kind of came about. Because people always ask me, so why'd you write that book? And so I thought I'd explain it. And I'll give you a little bit of background to start with, which is that it's a story, at its core, it's a story about homecoming when you really don't want to come home and you don't actually know what home means anymore. And it's told from two points of view. One is Giles Arley Evans, who's a third-generation waterman who lives on a river that resembles remarkably the Little Wicomico River. And his estranged daughter, who's named Lily Ray, and she lives in Maine when the story begins. And they've been apart for 14 years. She left home right after high school, couldn't wait to get out, and never wanted to come back. And now he's fallen ill, and so she's been compelled to come back. So the first part that I'm going to read to you is Lily, and this is in the beginning of the book, and this is right after she's found out that Giles has had a stroke and she's got to come home. Lily reached up for the rail of her sailboat as a gust of wind sliced across the harbor. She felt the smooth teak beneath her hands and took a deep breath, focusing on that reassuring steadiness under her fingers. Sheltered in the sailboat's lee, the yard skiff was less skittish than it had been coming across the harbor. Still, she saw Willie's big hand grab the sailboat's rail as well, his tree trunk arm holding the two boats apart in the cuffing wind. I don't know, Miss Evans, you know, I don't think you should be going out today. I can't do a Maine accent very well, so I'm sorry about that. Willie's accent seemed even flatter against the thin, cold air. Weather Service has a small craft advisory out for the harbor. You'd be better off waiting for this front to pass. Why, I saw that Saturday's going to be lovely spring weather. 50 degrees they're calling for, if you can imagine. Hardly any wind to worry about, maybe 15 knots. Lily smiled. Her boat moved around its mooring ball in the breeze, restless as a racehorse. The white hull gleamed in the brittle sunlight. She looks great, Willie. You didn't have to wax her. She heard him behind her making that snorting sound he did when one of his customers was foolish enough to ignore his hard-earned know-how. Without looking, she could see him shaking his head under the blue wool watch cap, his wrinkled neck skinny and white beneath the turned-up collar of his pea coat, his long nose wagging like an admonishing finger. Willie Perkins had owned this scrap of boatyard in South Portland for 50 years, after he'd decided he didn't want to spend a lifetime lobstering. He had a soft spot for her, she knew. He enjoyed a boat with classic lines. "Your little boat, Miss Evans," he would say. "That's a fine boat. Carl Alberg design, you can see it a mile away. In that sheer line, those overhangs, that's how God meant for a boat to look." She knew he would never launch her boat for the season, even this early, without first polishing the winter off her, making her look pretty for spring, even if it wasn't really spring. This was Maine, after all, and spring was more of a frame of mind than an actual season. Lily pushed herself up enough to get one knee onto the rail, then swung all the way and nimbly climbed over the lifeline onto her boat. She smiled back at Willie. He frowned at her. "I guess I'm not talking you out of it," he yelled over the breeze. He shook his head one more time. "I'll be waiting on 13 when you're ready to come in." He twisted the throttle and the outboard sputtered and whined as he turned the skiff downwind. She watched him go for a moment, the skiff's boxy stern rising up to meet the waves, Willie's sturdy back rounded against the wind. She slid open the hatch and poked her head below. It was even colder there than outside, the fiberglass hull seeming to absorb the water's chill and hold it. She tossed her backpack to the small settee and then got to work. She raised the mainsail, dashed forward to let the mooring line slip into the frigid water, then unfurled the jib with a snap. The sails slapped and banged around momentarily, then suddenly they filled and the boat heeled over sharply as if swatted by a huge paw. She winched the sails in, double-checking their trim, and maneuvered her boat through the small field of mooring balls that dotted this end of the harbor like mushrooms. They were all empty still, awaiting the boats whose owners had better sense than she, or perhaps just less stubborn desire. A wave slapped the hull and the wind needled the spray into her face. "Come on," she taunted under her breath. "Show me what you got. I could use an honest fight." She felt better already. It was a fact that a boat was an inanimate object, an organized aggregate of fiberglass and wood and fasteners, but Lily never questioned the fundamental truth of how alone she felt when she was apart from this one. It was a Cape Dory Typhoon, small, capable, and simple enough for her to take out for a quick afternoon sail, but with an efficient tiny cabin that afforded basic comfort and necessities for a weekend away from the city. Within the boat's 19 feet, Lily found life distilled to its minimum, a clarity that eluded her on land. The little boat's elegant lines were deceptively sweet. For all its grace, it was tenacious as a bulldog. She had named the boat Pelagic, for the wandering, solitary creatures whose home was the sea. As she passed a shelf of rocks, a pair of seals watched her. Great manes of seaweed lay draped over the granite, waiting for a rising tide to lift them and transform them into swaying green forests. She breathed the rich, musky smell of the ocean's edge, and beyond it came the clean, clear scent of the sea. She'd probably have to stay in the harbor today. Willie was right about it being too rough in the bay. She loved that about Maine. There was no mediocrity to it, no middle ground. All was contrast, a constant battle of extremes. One moment she could stretch her vision across the water until the horizon's edge simply quivered and disappeared. No wonder there was a time people believed you could fall right off of it. The next fog could narrow that wide world to a fleecy cocoon that bent sound, smothered the sun, and defeated all sense of direction. One mistake here, and you and your boat were smashed to bits or left high and dry on a ledge, with the seals and the gulls wading through a humiliating low tide. She appreciated this lack of forgiveness. It helped to know where things stood. She glanced up and checked the telltales, little strips of parachute material attached to the jib's leading edge that let her know if she needed to ease the sails or trim them in, or if the wind had shifted slightly. Paying attention to them was like taking a pulse of the boat, the wind, this little crucible of the world. In the bigger gusts, she had to let the boat's nose come up and spill the sails a little. The whole boat would shudder at the tension of the forces being thrust upon it, and then charge off again when Lily eased it back down off the wind. Sharp gust caught her by surprise and buried Pelagic's rail in roiling water before she could regain control. "Blowing dogs off the chains," she said. Surprised, the words had come out that way. That was her daddy talking. She settled the boat back down, thought about heading in, and kept going. The tanker was making its way down the channel toward the waiting cranes of the port. Rust sheeted down its sides like rain. She tacked the boat to let the ship cross well ahead of her. "They say he's like as not going to die, Lily Ray," Mary Virginia had said to her on the phone this morning. "You need to come on home now." As if she were an errant child who had run away on a whim in peanut butter sandwiches. Come on home now, as if she'd been gone a day and a night rather than 14 years. As if it could be called home. The phone call had come right at the busiest point of her morning shift. She wasn't even sure she had heard the voice on the other end of the line quite right. No one around here called her Lily Ray or even knew her that way, given name and middle, always said together as one. Never just Lily, not down in Ophelia, where the dogs blew off the chains, where people had that peculiar way of putting extra words around what should have been a simple enough concept. Why not just say, "Things look grim. He's going to die"? Ophelia, where nobody ever ran away, and where fathers were always called daddies, no matter what kind of cold stone sons of bitches they might be. Beneath her, Pelagic slid through the choppy water with the easy grace inherent in something completely at home with itself. She sailed just outside the harbor up to Big Diamond Island, glancing toward the houses there. She had thought about renting a place on one of the Casco Bay Islands, liking the concept of being separated from the city and closer to the sea. But she scuttled the idea when it became obvious that the ferry schedule would be too undependable for her work at the Bureau with its changing shifts and unpredictable emergencies. She watched a school bus crawl along the shoreline road, stopping now and then and popping open, the kids bursting from it like seeds from a jewelweed. She knew they must be shouting with their freedom, but the wind tore their voices away. A line of cars followed the bus like ducklings. The trees along the road swayed in the breeze. Some of the houses on this side of the island were new, big and brassy, with enormous windows that flashed in the sun. Most, though, were older cottages built low and tight against the elements. Smoke curled up from their chimneys until the wind caught it and whisked it instantly away. She imagined its scent against the firs. She imagined the snug rooms below, the fire glowing somewhere. From out here on her boat, a chilly fleck of white in the gunmetal water, the whole island seemed to her like some kind of diorama, or one of those elaborate tiny landscapes you could see at Christmas time in the shop windows down in the old port. Here, perhaps she could reach out and change things. Move the white steepled church over to make room for a lighthouse high on the hill, add some trees sloping down to the west, give the town a little beach instead of just rocks. Make sure all the little bulbs in the houses didn't burn out so the windows kept that warm, perfect, happy glow. There was a time when she had thought often about Gines dying. Maybe he would wrap his Ford pickup around an oak tree down on the road to the post office, or simply step off the washboard of the Jenny Ray one day, little flick of a wave when he was alone out there, and poof, gone. Alone in her bed at night, as the wind howled around the corner of the big white house, she would let her young imagination weave the whole grand tapestry of her father's untimely, yet poetically just demise. They would search for him. They always did. They would find the Jenny Ray still afloat, tow her in, empty and forlorn, but they wouldn't find Gines. The tide would take him, pull him along under the surface, moon-faced and wrinkled, so his glassy eyes could stare up at the arching sky until one day, weeks or months later, some beachcomber or maybe another waterman would see something floating, something odd. Because he had drowned, there would be no laying out for Gines in the parlor. What was left of him, what the crabs hadn't gotten, would have to go straight to the casket and then into the family cemetery, the Grove. Everyone would say how it was a blessing that the Bay had given him up, that he could come home and lay to rest in the good earth with his wife and his parents and the rest of his kin, not be doomed to the fate of some who float on forever. But Gines had not stepped off the Jenny Ray. He and his Ford hadn't eaten a tree on the way to the post office. The stubborn bastard had just kept on living, such as it was. And so had she, avoiding his silent, brooding bitterness. And when he fell asleep in front of the television after dark, she would creep in and stare at his indecipherable face that looked creased and worn as an old glove. How had her mother loved this man? And how had she known how to make him love her, no matter what? What was the secret? Lily would watch his face in the blue TV light and then creep back to bed and dream of another father, another life, far from the big white house on the point where Evanses had lived for as long as anyone could remember. And so, it seemed, would she. The sharp blast of a ferry's horn startled her. It was the 4 o'clock boat from the city, and she was straying into its path. She tacked Pelagic quickly away. Willie would have given her no end of grief for that, she thought, getting run down by a ferry. It probably surprised the hell out of the ferry pilot to see a small boat out here on a day like this time of year. The greasy scent of diesel lay thick on the water as she crossed the ferry's wake and pointed her boat toward Willie's boatyard. What little there was of warmth in the feeble spring sun was fading entirely with the late afternoon. Her hands were stiff, and she shivered as she made up the sails and tidied her boat, but neither the sound of Willie's laughter when she told him about the ferry, nor the stream of hot air from her truck's heater did much to warm her. Okay, so now we're going to lighten up a little bit. And I'll introduce you to Gines. So at this point in the story, Gines has already tried to go back out fishing. He recovers from the stroke, he tries to go back out fishing and has an accident out there. and realizes he can't do this anymore. And so to keep himself from going completely nuts, he wanders out into the shop one day, and actually she follows him out there, and she finds this stack of cedar. And she asks him what it was for, and he said it was for a skiff. And she says, well, why don't you build it? And at first he thinks that's, a ridiculous idea, but he goes back out to the shop. So that's where we are now. He's out in the shop. Gines pulled the tarp back with a snap. Amid the cloud of dust, the smell of the cedar came at him like a freight train pulling with it a carload of memory. The tree had stood down near the marshy point long before he was a boy. Most boys wouldn't have noticed it particularly unless they were thinking about climbing it or building a tree fort, and since cedar trees weren't much good for either occupation with their soft, snappy wood and bushy branches, it could have just been another tree. Near Magnolia now, that was a tree for climbing, with its low, strong branches that laddered straight up to the top and the waxy leaves that provided a secret hideout and shelter from the weather even in winter. But Gines was the son of a man who loved to build boats as much as take them out on the water to work, and so his daddy never let him walk past a tree without pointing out its particular features, its uses, the merits of its wood as well as the flaws, the shape of its nuts and cones, and even its inherent beauty. By the time he was 9, he could identify the fine distinction between the Atlantic white cedar and the eastern red, the short-leaf pine with its stubbier needles that poked out in pairs versus the loblolly whose longer needles came in bundles of 3, the dappled bark of the sycamore that was a dead giveaway even in winter, the white oak with its round lobed leaves, the red with its sharp pointed ones, the willow oak with the long slender leaves that gave it its name. You want to keep an eye peeled for the good ones, his daddy told him, and look after them. Help them along if they need it. Make sure none of that damn honeysuckle or wild grapevine gets up on the trunk and the branches. Keep the damn maples and poplars from growing like the weeds they are all around it and shading it out. A good tree ain't no different than a good boat. You got to be responsible to it. Gines' daddy had spied the white cedar out near the marsh and made a special note of pointing it out to his son. Best boat building wood there is come from that tree, he said. Easy to work, built, strong as a bull, but nice and light. Gines had watched that tree grow all his life, even as fewer and fewer of them seemed to be showing up near the river, and when the time came to build a boat that he wanted to be extra special, he made his peace with the tree and took it down. The wood was just as beautiful as his daddy had told him it would be, strong and straight, light and supple. And here it had sat, still protected, still his responsibility. Looking at it, he felt the rush of years come upon him like a wave at the shore, almost knocking him down. He was an old man now. He truly was. Felt nearly as old as his tree had been when he dropped her. Never thought he'd get this far. Sometimes wished he hadn't. He tugged the tarp back further and uncovered the whole stack. It was good stuff. He could sell it right off and make a nice bundle. You just couldn't find wood like this around here anymore. Boat builders had to go as far south as the Carolinas, pay a pretty penny for it, and then pay some more to ship it home. Selling it as is would be the practical thing to do. What was the point of trying to build a skiff now, even if he could do it? True, he could probably sell one for $7,000, $8,000 to one of these come-heres who thought it was just the bee's knees to have a boat built by what they called a local craftsman. Gines snorted. Put me in the Smithsonian, he thought. He slid the top board out a little, testing its weight, and he had to admit it felt good in his hands. The roughness of the surface scraped his skin, and he liked that prickly feeling, like this wood still had plenty of that tough old tree in it. And he knew his decision. It came to him loud as a bell. He wasn't so far gone as to forget all that had gone into making this wood what it was, all the days and nights, storms and calms, floods and freezes, bugs and birds. Maybe he should have been, but he wasn't so desperate for money that he would take a piece of his own history and sell it to the highest bidder. Wouldn't be any different than selling the house or the land or the Jenny Ray. What did he have but all that was past? Gines set to work. The first thing to do was dress the wood, get it ready for working. That meant pushing it through the planer, a despotic piece of machinery that dated from Gines' grandfather. He called it the Beast. Made of nothing but black iron, the Beast was unlike any other heavy equipment that Gines had inherited. The Beast had been built in 1909 at the Josiah Ross Iron Works in Buffalo, New York. That information was stamped into one of the side plates just in case anyone had a notion to track down the hell-fired furnace of its birth. It had a density that seemed to defy gravity. It didn't just occupy space, it consumed it. Gines had read about black holes in the National Geographic, and that's how he thought of the beast, a black hole, a cosmic force. If you weren't careful, if you didn't approach it with the appropriate respectful attitude, it could pull your whole arm into it, devour it before you had time to keel over. Acknowledging his weakened state, he did not try to face the beast without a little help. He pulled the sawhorse over to where it sat about 4 feet in front of the planer. Then he placed another one about the same distance out the back and one more about another 5 feet out to catch the wood and support it as it came through. He'd figured on a skiff about 16 feet. The boards were 20 feet long. He'd keep the extra length for now, could always trim it later, but he needed to plane the boards from their present thickness of 1 inch to about 7/8. That might mean as many as 3 passes for each board, and he was probably going to need 2 boards per side, and that was just the sides. He would still have to dress the wood for the keel, the chine, the keelson, the ribs. He shook his head, knowing if he sat there thinking about the task ahead, like as not, he wouldn't even get through 1 board. Back when he was young and strong, he could dress nearly all the big wood for a skiff like this in maybe an afternoon. He didn't have any illusions about how long it might take him now. Turning a small shiny wheel, Gines adjusted the planer's cutting surface to the height he thought would be about right to take off the first layer of wood, but not have it snag up in the blades and kick back. He pulled the top board off the pile and positioned one end of it on the first sawhorse, moved it close to the short table that served as the tongue for the beast's dark slit of a mouth, and pushed the switch. The lights dimmed for a second, and the beast came to life with a slow roar, deceptively smooth at this point. He took a deep breath, steeled his shoulders and arms, and slid the end of the wood into the planer. When the blades grabbed the board's end and started chewing, the sound alone was enough to make you think a child of Satan was in there. The low roar instantly changed to a snarling roar that made you want to clap your hands over your ears lest you listen too long and go mad. It always amazed Gines how something that sounded so god-awful destructive could produce at the other end a piece of wood that was fair and clean, something almost sweet. Didn't seem possible, but on the other hand, that's the way life was sometimes. The hotter the fire, the harder the steel and all that. He leaned hard into the wood and felt it kick against him at first. Then the beast took over and the wood simply trembled as he pushed it slowly through. As it emerged from the other end, it slid over the first sawhorse. He hoped it would make it to the second one. Either way, he was going to have to get over to the other side before the wood went all the way through. It was only a question of how fast he was going to have to move, and of course, how fast he could. He'd have to go without the cane. It would only get in the way. If he had someone on the other end, he wouldn't have to play this game of leapfrog around the thing. A helper, the way he used to help his daddy, could just grab the end and pull her steady while he fed the last of it in. He didn't like to be thinking about these things when he was feeding the beast. He didn't like to be distracted at all. The damn machine could sense weakness and fear like a high-strung horse, he was sure of it. Wouldn't that be just the thing, he thought, to show up at the hospital again, but this time, instead of a couple of bruises, to have an arm halfway cut off? Wonder what that puppy Doc Wyatt would have to say about that. Jesus, just watch the wood, you old fool. Get your timing right. The far end of the slab of wood was approaching the second sawhorse. Come on, Gines muttered. You just get right on over that there now. He cackled a little as the wood nudged over the edge of the sawhorse like it knew where it was going. That's it. He was talking to it, urging it along. That's it. With about a foot of wood left to go across the planer's table and into the blades, he moved away and around the beast's side, it snarling like a dozen chainsaws in his ears, his eyes on the prize at the other end and not on where his feet were going. It was harder than he'd thought about with the cane. The wood was crawling through of its own accord as the beast's blades chewed across its surface and nudged it along, and he was counting on that little bit of help, counting on that momentum. He just wasn't counting on the way his one foot caught the leg of the second sawhorse as he came around it, and so he staggered, his hand coming down hard on the end of the board since that was the only thing right there to grab onto. He heard the beast's voice ratchet up a notch in irritation when the other end of the board flexed up into the planer blades. He felt the whole board vibrate and moan against the deeper bite as his hapless weight pushed the cleared end down. Then, with a final snarl, the beast spat out the last of the board. It shot up a foot or so with the force of Gines leaning on the other end, and with this little buck of freedom, the board dumped Gines unceremoniously and without hesitation on his ass, then skipped off the sawhorses and landed not an inch from his legs. As it was, the end cuffed his elbow hard enough for him to yell out loud, "You son of a whore! although whether he was yelling at the board, the beast, or the world at large was up for debate right about then. Gines gingerly rolled over to his hands and knees, crawled through the dusting of fresh cedar to the planer, and punched the off switch. The beast gave it up with a sudden deceleration, a downwinding of pitch and energy like a jet engine coming to rest. Its roar lowered to a whine and then a sigh, and finally a quiet that seemed unnaturally loud. Gines sat there a minute, then hauled himself up a bit by bit, using the planer for support. When he regained his feet, he leaned both hands on the beast table, then eased one behind to rub his lower back, both of which were already paying dearly for his clumsiness and evident lack of judgment. He moved to reach for his cane, which was leaning on the first sawhorse, leaving damp handprints on the planer's iron. Ears ringing, legs shaking, hands sweating, Gines realized he didn't have the energy left to fight the plain, unvarnished truth of the matter. He was going to need help. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about how this story came to be. And a lot of people ask me how it came about, and I think it's fair to say that it started right about here. This is my mom and dad. My mom and dad lived in southern Pennsylvania, and they had always loved boats. My dad was a merchant mariner in World War II, and I think he really wanted to go to sea as a career after the war, but then he met my mom, and she wasn't into being a mariner's wife. So he made a choice and ended up going to law school at night, getting his degree, becoming a lawyer. He owned his own practice in Westchester, PA. But he never lost that love of the water, and so he and Mom, long before I was born, would charter little boats on the Chesapeake, on the Sassafras River. Slow down. My earliest memories of the Chesapeake are in this boat, a 16-foot lapstrake Penyan, which Mom and Dad would launch at the Bohemia River, the river just to the north of the Sassafras. We'd take the boat out on the river and we'd find a piece of beach and we'd spend the whole day swimming and playing, and then toward that late afternoon they'd start a fire and we'd cook hot dogs. It was idyllic. There wasn't much boat traffic then, and what there were was small boats, and no one ever seemed to mind that we were hanging around on their beach. And at the end of the day, usually just before twilights, we'd come in, and the lucky ones, my older brothers and sisters, always got to argue over who got the water ski all the way in. I have these memories of this. I was always too young to ski, but I would watch, and the river would be like glass, and the sun was going down behind us, and the boat's wake was peeling away, and the skier, usually my brother Josh, was just loving life. When I was about 6 or 7, Dad finally convinced Mom to let him buy a sailboat, which is what he always really wanted. He started with a Columbia 30, and what I learned most from this boat was how to run aground. We did all of our sailing out of Georgetown and learned the hard way. And we didn't have a depth sounder at the time. We had a lead line. So Dad would just stand there ahead of the shrouds, and he'd call out the depths as we were going along. So we were going into this creek called Turner Creek, which is off the Sassafras, and it's got a very weird channel, very counterintuitive. And this time we were going into the creek for the first time, and he's up by the shrouds, and he's yelling, 10 feet, 10 feet. And then he sort of stops, and he goes, well, that can't be right. And then slam, we were in 4 feet of mud in a 6-foot keel boat. And this is when I also learned how to extract, all the ways to extract oneself from the Chesapeake. But it was a really wonderful way to grow up. My brothers and sisters were all gone by the time I was about, I guess, 10. And so my parents got me a Springer Spaniel named Brighty. And they gave me free rein with the dinghy, and this is how I spent my summer days. Just tootling around all over the Sassafras River near Georgetown with my best buddy. And I think this is really where my sense of place began, and it has everything to do with the color of the sand up there and the way the oak trees arch over the beaches, and the sound of the geese in the fall, and the way the honey locusts smell in the spring, and just all these things that, you know, just embed in you and imprint in you. And it has everything to do with being present and paying attention and in honoring the wonder in those simple things. There's a writer named Annie Dillard who I really like, and she says this about the world around us, particularly in the natural world. She says, beauty and grace are performed whether or not we will or sense them. The least we can try to do is be there. So that's what I started to learn how to do at this age. When I met my husband-to-be, he had also spent his whole life on the Chesapeake, but he was racing sailboats. So I started racing with him, and then we had babies, and so there wasn't a whole lot of racing anymore. And I told him if he didn't get me a sailboat soon, I was going to lose my mind. So he was very accommodating. He thought that was great. And so he picked out Luna, which was a Peterson 34, an old racing design that he knew well and loved. And she was a racing boat when we got her, but he turned her into a really fantastic cruising boat. And from the time our daughter was only a few weeks old, this was the boat that she was sailing on. Our son was about 3 at that point. I wanted for them the same thing that I had, which was a magic carpet of a boat on the bay. I wanted them to have a chance to grow up surrounded by the same beautiful beaches and big oak trees and starry nights. I wanted to be able to turn them loose with a little boat the same way I had been. And so that's what we did. Every weekend, from April through November, every vacation week, there was no soccer, there were no sports. We didn't tell them about sports, actually. There was sailing and there was sailing. And so they thought sailing was, the thing to do. We got a couple of little kayaks, little ones that fit them, and so the 4 of us could go out exploring together. And we found our own little beaches and our own places to make those kinds of memories that I did when I was a little kid. This is on the Wye River, which I don't know if any of you have ever been on, but it's absolutely my favorite. I think I was about 14 years old the first time I submitted a story to Chesapeake Bay magazine, and I was politely rejected. When I turned 36, I got a job there. And over time, I became the executive editor, and all I wrote about was the place that I loved, the Chesapeake, and what I loved doing most, sailing. And Luna was the perfect boat for this. We'd take off for a long weekend, and we'd sail to a place like this, Chestertown, and I'd write about it. And, I mean, what could be better, right? I wrote about towns, I wrote about rivers, I wrote about boat builders. This is Jimmy Drury. I don't know if any of you know him, but he was Newport News. The Mariners Museum is where I met him. This is Jimmy Pierce. He's a decoy carver up in Havre de Grace. And I also loved writing about places that nobody knew much about. And I was and am still amazed at how much of the bay I have not seen yet. And I think you just take your whole life and spend it poking around and still not see it. Anyway, in 2000, an editor from the Mariners Museum called me and said, did I know anybody who would like to take on a project and write a book about the bay, its people and places? And I said, sure, I'll do it. And I ended up writing this book, which is a series of 35 essays, and that's how I met this man, Walter Coles Burroughs. And this is where the novel started to take shape in my head. He was a pound net fisherman out of Bayvon, which probably most of you know where that is. He agreed to take me out fishing with him one day so I could write about pound netting on the bay for the book. So I went out with him, and we spent a lovely day out there. And back up. And I wrote everything down, and I also recorded him. And when we were done, we came back in, and instead of just saying goodbye, it's nice to meet you and everything, he said, would you want to come inside and have a cup of coffee? So I said, sure. So we sat down in his kitchen, and he started talking to me about his wife, who had died a couple of years earlier, and he missed her so much, he started crying, talking to me about her, and I did not even know what to do. This had never happened to me before with a man like this, for one thing. And he just wanted me to know all about her and about his life with her and without her. And when I left, I couldn't stop thinking about him and about his loneliness. So I wrote a story about him, and it was a chapter in the magazine, and it won a bunch of awards, and I was really happy, but I still couldn't stop thinking about him. Now, at the same time, I'd always wanted to write a novel. And there was only one place that I knew where I could actually see if I had the mots to write a novel, and that was the Breadloaf Writers Conference in Vermont. The Breadloaf was begun in 1926 by Robert Frost and Willa Cather. So it's a pretty serious place. It's Mount Olympus of literary writing, in my opinion. So I took that story I wrote about Walter Coles, and I fictionalized it. I'm like, how hard can it be? I'll just turn it into fiction. And I submitted it, and I got accepted, which completely blew me away. And I went up to Breadloaf, and went to workshop, and they completely destroyed me. Absolutely mauled me. I mean, but my workshop teacher said something that stuck with me. She said, a lot of writers with a lot less talent than you will succeed because they just keep on going. And a lot of writers with much more talent than you won't even get this far because they're just too scared to do it. So basically she just said, just keep going, just be brave, just keep on going. So I came home and I knew I had a lot to learn. I formed a writers group. I started taking fiction classes. The writers group, the three of us would workshop each other's work every month. I'd go into DC and we'd work together. At the same time, Johnny enabled me to quit the magazine and work full-time on, my husband Johnny, enabled me to quit the magazine and work full-time on the novel, which is a gift that I still think is remarkable and I'm not sure I can repay. If you have an artist in your life, I highly recommend you do this. They will be forever in your debt. Obviously, this is a work of fiction. Gines Arley Evans is not Walter Coles Burroughs. For one thing, he's a lot meaner than Walter Coles ever was. But I could never have written this book without knowing the Bay, as I've gotten to know her over all these years, and that's why I started all the way back with that sort of imprinting sense of place. And the geography of the book is kind of a mashup of Bayvon, New Point Comfort with the Northern Neck. I sort of took the whole thing and smushed it together. So when you read it, you'll be like, that's not where it's supposed to be. I know that. I just put it there. And it takes place in a house that many of you may know. Whoops. Oops, I forgot to tell you about the Little River. Yeah, go ahead. Keep going. This is Miss Lucy Haney's house. On Flood Point Road, and my brother and sister-in-law purchased it years ago, and I started coming down to visit, and it's this house that is the basis for the house in the book, which the house is also really a character too. The other thing that I wanted is I wanted the parts about fishing and boat building to be as accurate as they possibly could be. I saw that you had some pound netting photos that were on when I first came in here. That's why going fishing with Walter Coles was such a valuable experience, because I could smell it and hear it and see it and feel it. And these images were taken up on the Chester River by my son when he was working for Echo Hill Outdoor School. There's only one waterman left on the Chester River who still sets a pound net. And that's the other reason I wanted to write this novel, because I wanted to document one more time and in a different way these parts of the Bay's cultural history. What I consider to be the heart of the book takes place in the boat building shop after Gines can't go out fishing anymore. Like many watermen, he's also a skilled boat builder. He came from a long line of boat builders, and in winter, maybe if he didn't want to go oystering or whatever, he'd take on a repair job or even build a brand new dead rice skiff, which is what he is known for. But he's too weak to do the work on his own, so he asked Lily to help him. And this is where the two of them end up finding a common language. Not talking about all the ways they're disappointed in each other, or they're mad at each other, all the things that happened in the past, but in talking about how the boat comes together and using the language of the craft to find a common language where they can start to come at their past more obliquely. It's sort of a neutral language and a neutral place. To do this, I asked that man, George Butler, if I could hang out in his shop and watch him build a dead rice skiff. And he said yes. So I spent many weekends standing around, listening, scribbling, being cold, asking a lot of questions. And he was incredibly patient and kind and forthcoming. These photos were taken by Morgan Miller for the Virginia Folklife Program, part of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. And I like to think that, like organizations like Virginia Humanities, maybe the novel is helping preserve a little bit of this tradition also by trying to be as accurate as possible in the descriptions of the construction of the skiff. And George says that I nailed it, so I feel pretty good about that. Here's the next one. And one more. There. I want to read a tiny little bit, just a tiny little bit more from the book about why he builds this boat. why Gines chooses this boat to build. There were two types of skiffs his daddy had taught him how to build, a flat bottom and a dead rise. The flat bottom was a lot easier, went a lot quicker. You could use a skiff like that for netting soft crabs in the shallows or hauling it out to your pounds. You could put an outboard on her and use her for rock fishing in the rivers when the young stripers came in. Perfectly serviceable, useful boat, the flat bottom. Nothing wrong with it. But the fact was that he liked the dead rise better, and that's the type he had tried to perfect. It could be a right pain in the neck once you got up to planking the floor near the bow. Every single piece had to be measured and hand cut and measured and cut and measured again, and then shaped and fitted. Sometimes it would take a whole day just to get 3 or 4 planks up there finished. And even before that, you had to make sure the chine was just so, the angle exactly where it should be, or none of those boards would sit right and tight. You didn't have to think about that when you built a flat bottom. But that kind of precision pleased him. More than that, the dead rise was just plain pretty. It would turn out like a miniature version of his Jenny Ray with that cheeky, no-nonsense look up forward and a sheer line so fine it could make a dead man's heart beat. A man could get some satisfaction out of building something like that. I think maybe you could say that that little passage kind of sums up why I wrote the novel, because I knew how to write magazine stories all day long. And they were, like Gines' flat-bottom skiff, perfectly serviceable, perfectly useful. But what I wanted to do was something more complex and ultimately more beautiful and more meaningful. And I could not have done it without all of the people that I mentioned in this little talk, and without being on the Chesapeake Bay most of my life. I also want to say, before I forget, that the cover, let's see, if you click through, do we go back to the cover? Oh no, we go to my dog, which is what I like better not. The cover design was created and executed by my daughter. So I forgot to say that in the past, and I didn't want to forget this time. So now you can ask me all kinds of questions. Yes?
What does the imagery of the cover as done by your daughter represent?
Well, when you read the story, you'll understand, obviously, that she feels submerged, for lack of a better way to put it, oppressed by her past and by the culture that she's left. She doesn't, she drowned in it when she was younger, and that's why she escaped it. But in the image, she's also holding the boat up. And so I think that's what Bird was going for, actually. And she came down here, I guess it was last summer, looking around at some of the boats and took some photos, and she tried to get pretty accurate on the boat. So, and she and I talked about the colors for the watercolor wash, and I wanted it to kind of fade into that green you sometimes see, on the water here when you first head out of the jetties. And everybody seems to really like those colors, so.
Any other questions?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a term in naval architecture and shipbuilding called still water bending moment, and it has to do with sort of buoyancy, a vessel's buoyancy, and how the objects that are put in it, talking about shipbuilding here, affect its buoyancy and its righting moment and its bending moment. And so fundamentally it's about buoyancy and how you maintain buoyancy, given the fact that you have to carry around a lot of furniture, a lot of stuff. And when I first read the term, I thought it was one of the most beautiful series of words I'd ever read, and I loved it, and I wanted to use it somewhere. And then I started thinking about it as sort of like a metaphor for, life. I mean, because we're all trying to maintain buoyancy, even though we all carry around enormous amounts of stuff and baggage and luggage in the past, and like she is and her father is. And so that's kind of where that comes from. And it also comes from that thing that happens when you're like out on the river in the morning and it's dead still, and a boat goes by and the water will just bend, off the boat. That's also where it comes from.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. What would you advise an aspiring writer of fiction? What have you learned from this process? What mistakes did you make that you would hope others wouldn't make?
Well, first of all, if you're going to go someplace like Breadloaf, just go, with your armor on, for one thing. Although I did go back the following year and I did much better, so that was good. The reason I really wanted to write fiction is because, like everything else, it's a different muscle, it's a different discipline. So it requires you to think about things in a completely different way. I had to go to I literally went to a lot of classes. I sort of went back to school in a way. I took a lot of classes at the Writers' Center in Bethesda. It sounds so easy to write fiction, but if you're really trying to write it well, there's all these little nuances of things. Like, for instance, when there's a scene in the beginning where she's remembering being a little kid. And so all the language in that scene, all the wording, even the choice of words, everything reverts to what like a 9-year-old would think. So that when you read it, you're not really noticing it, but you're basically hearing the voice of a 9-year-old, not a 32-year-old. And it only lasts for that little short section, but then when she's back in the present, then I'm back to using the same kind of language that she typically uses. So, like, stuff like that, you don't know that unless you learn it somewhere. So I would recommend going to school, taking classes. I definitely recommend trying to develop a little group, 2 or 3 other people, maybe not too many more than that, because it gets unwieldy. But if it's 2 or 3 people, you can meet once a month. You can bring each other your work ahead of time, and then you can eat a lot of really good food and drink a lot of wine and critique each other. And it makes it less lonely, because it's really lonely. I mean, hour after hour, sitting there by yourself in your head, I mean, people say, oh, but you have your characters, no. It's kind of a lonely job. So I guess I would just recommend trying to learn as much as you can, and don't be scared. Just stick it out, put it out there. I mean, and also, for me, it was important to be accurate, but that's sort of my journalist background. I don't think all writers suffer from that.
I have a question for you. At what point did you create a title for your story? Before you wrote the book? After you wrote the book? Some revelation partway through?
When I was calling it Finding Ophelia for a long time. That has got a lot of baggage, right? Shakespeare and all that stuff, and I wasn't even referencing any of that. But
did you create it on your own, or did you have some help?
What, the title?
The title, yeah.
No, I pretty much figured it out by myself. I had actually read a book by a writer named, God, I'm going to forget his name now. Anyway, when I lived in Bath, Maine for a time, just a block from the ironworks, and there was a book called The Yard by Michael Sanders about the last ship that was constructed and launched on the ways up there before they started to launch them in dry dock. And it's a really neat book, but that's where I ran across that term, stillwater bending moment, and that just stuck in my head for years.
Question is, how long did it take for you to write the book? And I haven't listened to you read your own book. In your thought processes while you're reading it, do you think I could have revised this sentence? And I mean, is that something that you think of as a writer? Do
yeah,
you
actually, when I was
and dice
reading this, I was changing some stuff.
Yeah. I guess that's normal. I don't know. I've never written magazines or
it took me,
stories.
I've tried to figure this out, but I think if you add up all the linear time, it probably took 3 to 4 years. Really.
Just a second.
Although it was spread out for a long time.
Oh, rats. I forgot it already.
Oh, cat.
Might you...
No.
Might you record
Oh.
this in a talking book, because
I thought you were going to ask would I do more.
Oh. Well, That's a good question, too. But we have a friend who would not be able to read the book, but I think he would love it.
Oh. Well, I wouldn't do it myself. I'd ask somebody else to do it because I don't really like my reading voice, but I do know somebody who could do a really good job of that. That's an interesting idea.
But I was just thinking what a fabulous storytelling reading voice you have. And I think people would love to have it from you.
Well,
In my not so
take
humble
that under
opinion.
advisement.
Well, if there are no other questions, please feel free to have.
Thanks again for having me.
Wendy, thank you so much.